One of the biggest talents in the world of chess, Nodirbek Abdusattorov from Uzbekistan takes on the world champion Magnus Carlsen. Magnus is currently leading the tournament solely with 7.5 out of 9. He had just beaten Duda in the ninth round. This is a new day, and if Magnus wins, he would most likely go home with the title. Abdusattorov is of course much lower rated than Magnus, but look at his focus. He's out there for the kill and the game begins. Off we go with c4 on the board. It's the English opening, and you will always see Magnus taking his time before making his move. His first move, he wants to feel comfortable, he wants to feel focused and totally into the game. Knight to f6 played here. Nodirbek gets his knight out, and now Magnus puts his pawn on e5. Knight to f3 and knight c6. We have the 4 knights on the board, and Nodirbek plays his favorite line with e4. Notice that bishop c5 is a mistake because of knight e5. That's the reason why Magnus goes for bishop b4, and now d3 played in the position. d6 by Magnus, bolstering the center. The bishop is asked a question. It goes back to c5 and b4, pushing the bishop away. Bishop b6, and Nodirbek wants that bishop at all costs. He goes knight a4. Magnus sees there's a hole on d4, so he pins the knight on f3. After the bishop is taken, bishop b2 to get some control on d4. Bishop takes f3. Carlsen has given up both his bishops, so it's actually going to be 2 knights versus 2 bishops, and look at this maneuver. He goes knight d7. He wants to put his knight from f8 to e6 to d4. First, a queen trade offered to Nodirbek, and Nodirbek declines it. He goes back to d1. Magnus goes knight to f8. It's all about this d4 square weakness. Are the knights stronger or are the bishops? The knight comes out to e6, and Nodirbek castles now, because now he has an idea of playing f4 when his rook would be activated and also his bishop. But look at Magnus's move. He has nipped f4 in the bud with g5. What a move. Bishop h3, and Magnus goes for h5. Is he going for an all-out attack? Well, Nodirbek exchanges one of the knights there, and now queen takes e6. b5, pushing the knight away. You can't come to d4 because the bishop will snap it off. Magnus now thinking where to move his knight. He goes knight b8. He's undeveloping it, but the knight is coming to d7. f4, there you go. Nodirbek opens up the position, but whose king is going to be weaker? Is it Magnus's king on e8 or Nodirbek's king on g1? Knight d7 played. But you can see from the body language that Nodirbek really believes in his position. He puts his king on the side on h1. Magnus knows he has to play carefully. Queen g4, offering a trade of queens once again. Will Nodirbek take it? He goes queen f3, and now Magnus could have exchanged the queens here and continued later on with king e7 or so on, but he plays f6, which is actually a good move. But now Abdusattorov is like, maybe I don't need to exchange the queens anymore, and he goes queen e3. He keeps the queens on the board. Magnus has to decide what to do about his king, and he decides to long castle. The king would be safe there, because for white to go a4 a5 will take time. Nodirbek first closes the center with f5 and h4 on the board. So rook g8 may come in, then h3. There's no time to attack. So Nodirbek plays on the king side, and queen h5 is played here. And in goes the rook to g6. That is an advanced outpost on an open file. Now the knight cannot move because the f6 pawn would be hanging. So Magnus has to decide how to continue here. He challenges the rook with bringing his rook d to g8. The position is right now better for black. The reason is that the knight seems to do more in this position than the bishop, and also the rook is offered for a trade. Nodirbek now brings his other rook and puts pressure on g8. So Magnus must take the rook on g6. Also on time, Magnus has 5 minutes, Nodirbek has 4 minutes 40 seconds, and after thinking for quite some time, he takes with the pawn, which is maybe the correct decision here. Now Carlsen says, I want that pawn, but Nodirbek pushes it to the 7th rank. Queen h7 played, maybe not the best move. Queen h3, excellent move by Nodirbek, because now after the rook trade, yes, he's lost his g pawn, but in return he's got the h pawn. So the position is now equal. Knight to c5 played by Magnus. He goes to c1. You can't take on d3 because of queen h3 check. So c6 played. Carlsen is still very hopeful that his position is better, that his knight is stronger than the bishop. But white also has his trump card here. And his big trump card is his h pawn. The h pawn is a passer. Right now, it's a little guy on h2. But as it keeps moving, it will become an important factor in the game. Queen f3. Queen h7 played by Magnus. Look at how Nodirbek has managed his time. He has 2 minutes as compared to Carlsen's 40 seconds. But guys, there is a 10-second increment per move. So the world champion isn't much worried there. He goes king a6 with 26 seconds only on his clock. Nodirbek brings his king in. He's hoping that at some point he can start pushing his h pawn. The position still remains completely equal. Queen g7. Now maybe time to move your king to f2. Get it towards the center. He goes to f1. And now queen h7 played. h3 by Abdusattorov. The first step of the h pawn is taken, but there are 6 more steps to go. 5 more steps. d5 played by Magnus. Look at him. He's playing for win here. Queen f5. Now taking the queen here would not be a great idea, because then after queen f5, ef5, the h pawn is a passer. So Magnus now gets really focused, because there's also queen c8 check threatening somewhere. He goes queen g8, keeps the queen on the board. Takes on d5, cd. You can see that Magnus is slightly worried, but he is so ambitious. He wants to win this game. Draw is not enough. From the tournament situation, a draw is actually pretty good for Carlsen, but he wants to dominate. King to b5. And now bishop e3 played here. Nodirbek has managed to keep the position roundabout even here. Queen g2 check. Bishop comes back. And how does Magnus make progress here? Oh, he's trying to move his king down the board. King a4. Oof. And Nodirbek says, take the a pawn if you like. I'm pushing my h pawn down the board. So that is definitely a cause of worry. e4 played here. And now takes. He takes with the knight. There's no real threat in the position. And actually Nodirbek can now play queen f3 and exchange the queens. He plays it. Plays it, and Magnus should take it perhaps. No, he goes queen g6. Knight and queen coordinate pretty well, but h5, the pawn moves one step closer. Now queen e8, and you can see that Nodirbek is shaking his head. He's not too happy here, because guys, there is a trick in the position. There is a discovered check on the e file, and if bishop e3 is played here to block it, then Magnus can take the pawn on h5. Look at this variation. If bishop e3, I can take queen h5, knight g3 with a fork. So bishop e3 does played, and Nodirbek knows that now he cannot win this position. Magnus sees, oh, and he goes f5. He doesn't want to go into that drawish line. He wants to still fight for a win. h6, Nodirbek's pawn now moving to h6. Just 2 steps away from queening. Queen to e5 by Magnus. King f1, playing it calmly here. Although black's pieces are coordinating much better, the h pawn is worth its weight in gold here. Now threatening knight d2 check. Magnus is so tricky. But Nodirbek, of course, tactical monster. He goes king g2. He sees all these tricks. And now queen g8 check. And the king comes to h3. Well, keeping the knight on the board is important, but Magnus now goes for knight g5 check. A very surprising decision, because after queen takes g5, it seems not very likely that he can win, but Magnus thinks he can win this h6 pawn. He wins the a pawn. Now this is the moment where Nodirbek can make a draw, because there's a perpetual there. The king is moving to a5. Oh, he goes to a5. Check here. And I think Magnus is fine with a draw now, because there are a lot of checks here in the position and there's no way to get out of it. But Nodirbek says no draw. I have an advanced pawn, and there you can see Magnus settling down in his chair. He knows this is not going to be a quick draw, because now the tables have turned. It's still a draw. The position is still drawn, but with the h pawn, White's chances of winning are much higher, because in queen endgames, it's not important how many pawns you have always. Also, the quality of the pawn matters a lot. Right now, the pawn has reached the 7th rank, and with just 8 seconds on clock, Magnus goes queen to e5. This is a mistake. He should have gone queen g1. But in queen endgame, it's very difficult to take advantage of these errors. Queen d1 check is the correct move, but he goes king g4, and we are again in drawish territory. And now Magnus pushes his pawn to f3. Well, if you take it, then well, there's no real threat. He actually takes it, and Magnus has no check which wins the pawn, because the pawn is defended. So he's just given up the pawn. And there you can see, with just 6 seconds left on the clock, it's a very difficult endgame. And Nodirbek playing with so much confidence. Check on h4. And he moves in with his king even further down. Carlsen definitely has something to worry here. He is hesitating. He gives a check on h5. But the king can now go to the corner on a8. Objectively, it's still drawn. Practically, this is very difficult. Magnus thinking from where to give a check. Also, the time on the clock is not helping him. He has just 3 seconds. He gives a check on g6. Nodirbek, meanwhile, maintaining a healthy lead with 40 seconds on his clock. He goes king to c7. And another check on g3. King b7. Where do you check from next? I think f3 looks like a normal check. Magnus plays queen f3. He's managed to play this carefully, but how many accurate moves can you make with just a few seconds on the clock? Queen f6. Maybe the answer is Magnus can make many. After all, he's the world champion. Queen f2 check. King b7. Nodirbek trying his hardest here for the full point. He now blocks with the queen. If you take the queen, of course you lose, because the h pawn queen. So a check here threatening the h7 pawn. So the only move now is to put queen to c7. Check on f3. This time king a6. And he can go queen f6 check here once again. But maybe he didn't like queen b6. And then the b5 pawn falls with no check in the position. So Magnus here once again decides to give a check from a8. Just fine. But after king b6, he has no checks. So he goes to h8 and blocks the pawn. But this gives Nodirbek a free hand to now start his checks. And how does he do it? Well, maybe the first check has to come from c2. Also, Carlsen has built up enough time with the last few checks. He has now 35 seconds. And the position still is drawn. Check on c2. Now king a3 seems like the right move. White does not want to take the b5 pawn, because that pawn, if taken, black can start checking him. So here Nodirbek is careful with what he wants to do. Now he has 30 seconds, and so he goes queen d3 check. The right move here is king a4, going back. But then you lose the b5 pawn with the check, which is fine. But Magnus decides to go king a. He's confused. Come back, go forward. He goes king a2, and this is actually not the best move. This can give Nodirbek some chances to win. Queen g6 might be the best move here in this position. Table bases say it's mate in 70, but of course there is a 50 move rule there. So first king c5, and now a check on c8 or a check on f8 would have been good. But Magnus, now with just 20 seconds on the clock, takes a pawn in his hand. He's thinking, how exactly should he continue? And he decides, should he give up the b pawn? Oh man, he's going to give up his b pawn, which is going to be a big blunder. It's going to be the losing mistake, and he plays it. He plays b4. But little does he know that this is actually losing. Queen d2, and now king a3 important. He blunders with king a1, misses queen d4 check, and Magnus understands that he's blundered here, because after the queen trade, the h pawn goes forward. Here's another angle with so many people watching, and Magnus has lost the game. Nodirbek has taken the lead. Magnus being a very gentleman here, arranging all his pieces, but he has lost the lead, and a 16-year-old phenom from Uzbekistan has beaten the world champion. What a big result.